Hi everyone, I'm Elspeth from Ragged Life, and this is the fourth video in my peg loom weaving for beginners series of videos. And you can see it in front of me here. I've got a freshly made peg loom woven rug, which was made using our recycled sari silk ribbon from Ragged Life and one of our 90cm wide peg looms. And in this particular video, I'm going to be teaching you how you successfully take your peg loom woven creations off the peg loom and finish them all off and make them all look nice and neat and everything. If anyone's a complete beginner to this technique and you want to see how to set up the peg loom, what equipment you need and how to do the weaving itself, I suggest you check out some of my earlier videos in the series. So what we have in front of us here is a peg loom woven rug, and at the moment you can see that I've still got some of the weaving on the actual pegs themselves. So the first step of finishing off your creation is that you always need to transfer any weaving that you've got on the pegs off the pegs onto the warp, which you'll find out how that's done kind of properly in my previous video. But this is known as advancing the warp. So I'm now going to just take all of this peg loom weaving off the pegs onto the warp, and then we'll get cracking. Right, I'm back again, and I've taken all of the weaving off the pegs. So you can see here that it's just been transferred onto the warp strings that are in front. For the next part of the process, the finishing off, you're always best off having the weaving coming towards you. So actually what I'm going to do now is turn this weaving around, which may be a little bit cumbersome. It's such a big rug, this one. And then we're going to switch the camera angle and show you how it all works from the back. Okay, so now what we've got is we've got the weaving here, and then you can see some of the exposed warp strands. The aim of the game now is that we need to knot off our warp strands at the top of the rug, an even distance from the pegs down. Whatever you do, don't cut all of the warp strands at once, because these can suck into the weaving, and then once they've disappeared, they're very hard to kind of fix once you've gone there. So what we're going to do is starting away from the tail. So the last bit of weaving that I did was on the right side of the loom, furthest from this side. You start furthest from the tail and you carefully cut the warp strands from the first two pegs. And you can see that I've only cut one side of the hole. Then you take those pairs, and now we are trying to do this in a very secure knot. So I'm knotting those two pairs together. I'm just doing them in a fairly simple knot, but I'm trying to knot them so that it butts up to where the weaving becomes dense again. So I'm not kind of knotting up here where it's loose, I'm knotting where it's kind of at its densest. And I just give it a little bit of a tug. And then I normally like to do these in a real treble knot. Sometimes I even put a little bit of glue on these knots just to give them extra kind of sturdiness. And then once you've knotted off the pairs of strings from two pegs, so that's 4 strings total, you then do the same with the next 2 pegs. So you take the strands, you take them here. But now it's really important that when you knot these off, you try and get the knot at the same rough level as your previous one. So you're trying to create a flat edge to the end of your rug. So once again, do a double or a treble knot, like so. And you just make your way slowly from one end of the rug to the other. Whatever you do, you want to make sure that you do this really carefully, and occasionally you can tug this final bit of fabric across just to get rid of any bagginess, but do this really carefully because you've spent quite a long time doing your weaving. The last thing you want is to make it end up not looking how you want it to just by rushing this knotting off process. So just keep knotting them off. And if you've got an odd number of warp strands, Somewhere in the middle of this process, I like to knot together the strands from 3 pegs together, which I'll show you in a second. And the reason why we do that in the middle is just because it disguises things a bit better rather than having it at the end of the weaving. But the whole idea is at this stage, we're just trying to protect the weaving and stop it from falling off the ends of our warp strands. But you can kind of see here, I'm trying to create quite a straight flat edge to my weaving, which sometimes requires clawing this down and moving some of the last strand of fabric across to tighten things up. When you're trying to knot off 3 strands together, you start off by cutting the 2 that are closest and almost do them in a little single knot together, like this. Give that a little tug to tighten it up. And then once you've got that as a single one, then you cut your next one and also knot that off to that one. And then once you've got them as a 3, I try and then knot them, not a very specific way, but just knot them together so that they're all nicely bound as a trio. So kind of come through here, and then take your next one and just knot them off like this. So here we are at the end of the weaving, so I'm just going to knot off these last ones from the last 4 pegs. So taking these ones, knotting them off with a treble knot. As I said, just occasionally tugging this last strand through so that it just kind of tightens up any bagginess in the weaving. Oops, just give that another knot. And then your final pair feels like a nice achievement. And don't worry about this tail here, because this tail gets sewn in at the end. So we just need to make sure that we are knotted off nice and securely. And as I said, I often like to do that as a treble knot, just to make sure that we're all nicely secure. There we go. So here I am, having actually taken all of my peg loom weaving off the loom, and as you can see here, I've knotted off the top edge. This was the side that was closest to the pegs of the peg loom, and I've tried to get this edge as flat as possible, so it's nice and straight. It's a lot easier at this end because you've almost got the straight edge from where the weaving's been butting up against more weaving further down. Always at this stage, we go and fix our original end, because as I said in one of my previous videos, the other end of the peg loom weaving always looks like a bit of a dog's dinner from the very beginning. So what I'm going to do is just throw my rug over the table, try not to lose it, it's getting away from me, and come back and sort out this very, very uneven end that I have here. So you always start off by almost like pulling the warp at the bottom to tighten up the weaving to the density that you want. So I always get a kind of like good idea of how tight I want it by first of all just giving these warp strands a little bit of a tug. You need to make sure that when you tug the warp strands, you're not making the other end of the weaving not straight, because we want to keep that nice and straight at the top. So once you get to this stage, you then want to work out what is the line of the peg loom weaving that I want to knot all of my knots to create a straight edge at this side. And I generally start off at the side of the peg loom weaving that didn't have the tail sewn up. So at the very beginning of our peg loom weaving, we sewed a tail up at the side, and I normally try and identify where was that tail sewn up the first edge. And mine was sewn up on this side, so I always start off by knotting off from the other side to begin with. And then the same way as before, we've already got some knots in there from at the very beginning, but we're going to re-knot them at whatever denseness that we want the peg-loom weaving to sit at. So we're starting off in the bottom left corner, and I want my knot to come here because I want this to kind of compress up to a decent denseness. And you can see if you do your knot down here, it's too loose. So I'm just going to kind of concertina it up. So I like to cut my warp and just take those two together and re-knot them, tightening up to the main body of the weaving. And you just take the strands from the two pegs and just do a treble knot to knot them off. Then you can probably see where I'm going with this. You take the strands from the next two pegs, so it would have been two of these together, so you've got 4 strands, and you're once again just knotting the pair together, but you're trying to get a straight edge along this side of the weaving. So when you reach the kind of like last little bit here, normally what I would do is if I've got the kind of tail running up the side of the peg-loom weaving, I'd just give it a little tug just to pull any extra bagginess from the corner. But these little bits, don't worry about them because these were where my strip finished and I had to begin a new colour. I'm going to sew these into the weaving so they'll totally disappear. Here I've got a trio to knot together to finish with, but you may just have a pair, which would generally be better. But I'm just going to knot off my final ones in the corner, and I'm once again just trying to get a straight edge onto the bottom side of the peg-loom weaving. Just give it a bit of a tie off. So now we've reached the end of our weaving, and we should have a relatively nice flat straight line to the bottom of our rug and the top of our rug. If you don't have a flat edge at either end, doesn't matter, you can just re-knot things off again, and you can keep kind of like chopping and changing and just tweaking things as best as you want. But once you reach this stage, you're now going to start sewing in some of the tails, whether they're at the side of the rug or in the body of the rug, or even these little warp strands at the ends, and I like to do that using a latch hook. So when you've taken off all of your kind of weaving off the loom and you've re-knotted both of your ends to make them nice and straight, you'll probably have some tails and lumpy bumpy bits that need sewing in. So I always start off with the last strip of fabric that I was working with when I took the weaving off the loom, and that's this one here. And I'm going to sew that in almost where the warp is running underneath these loops down the edge of the rug. So I start off by taking my latch hook, which is this little gadget here, and with the latch hook open, I kind of carefully work underneath, you can kind of see here, some of the loops that run down the side of the rug. So I'm almost just pushing it carefully through the channel that the fabric loops is creating. You can see here, and I'm aiming to go towards where my tail is. Then you place the fabric strip into the latch hook, and as a beginner I think you're best off just manually closing the latch like this, and then you just give it a pull and a wiggle, and you can see you can just pull your tail through, and then you just pull it as tight as you want it. So I'm just going to pull mine to there, and then you just snip it off like so. And you can do that with any kind of lumps and bumps that you've got running through. So if there was, for example, this little bit here, you may want to just pull that underneath a few of the loops just to sew it in. But if it's something that you've changed colour and you've got kind of like a break, it's always best to sew it under quite a few of the loops, maybe like at least 5 or 6, because you need it to be secure and not kind of come away from the weaving. So once you've done that with all of the fabric strips that are either sticking out the sides of the weaving or running through the body of the weaving, you can then decide whether you want to do the same with the warp strands that are left at the ends. I personally always prefer to kind of sew them in, because it just gives you a cleaner look. So I do exactly the same thing where I'm almost like wiggling my latch hook underneath some of those loops, running towards where the warp is. Then you place those warp strands into the latch hook, manually close it, and then just give it a pull and a wiggle and pull those warp strands up inside the body of the weaving, and then just trim them off. And the reason why we don't just chop them here is because if something went wrong and you've got rid of that length, it's really difficult to then try and re-knot things and fix issues. So by almost like pulling them inside of the body, you can disappear them into the body of the weaving so that it looks neat, but it means that you've still got them to hand if you did need to work with them. So just pulling through and then just chopping off. And you can just see that it looks much different when you've taken these and pulled them up inside of the body. And I would just repeat that process at both ends of the rug to give it a nice clean finish. And I'll show you an example of one of my rugs that I've done this with in a second, so you can just see how it looks when you've completely disappeared it into the body. So with this particular rug that I've got in front of me here, you can see it doesn't have those tassels coming out the end, because what I've done is I've just pulled them up through the body, and all you can see is at the very ends, the little tiny knot parts of the warp that I used. And this is quite a thick kind of plush rug that I've made here, because it was made using old mohair offcuts. So it's a very, very thick and warm rug. You'd get a very different look depending on what you used. So if you used t-shirt, it would be much thinner, and obviously cotton, once again, much thinner than this. But I love a good cozy rug personally. If you liked this video and you liked this series, definitely follow Ragged Life for more rag rug videos. And other than that, if you've got any questions, feel free to comment below. And thanks so much for watching.